In the hills of central Nepal, sometime around 1939, a recruiting officer for the British Indian Army looked at a boy who had walked for days to reach him and sent him home for being too small. The boy stood 4 feet 11 inches. He was below the minimum height, below the standard, below the line that separated a soldier from a civilian, and the officer turned him away. 6 years later, that same boy was alone in a trench on the far bank of a river in Burma, one hand blown off at the wrist, half blind, loading a bolt-action rifle built for a right-handed man with the only hand he had left, while wave after wave of Japanese infantry came out of the darkness to kill him. By the time the sun rose, 31 of them lay dead in front of his position. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard the name Lachhiman Gurung before today? Because what you are about to discover is stranger and larger than the headline that carries it, and it will change how you think about the men a great empire was willing to throw away. Now let's go. To understand how 200 small men from the Himalayas came to be surrounded on the wrong side of a river in the last spring of the Second World War, you must first understand the war that almost nobody back home was watching. The campaign in Burma was the longest the British fought in the entire conflict, and it was also the one they remembered least. There were no liberated cities photographed for the newsreels, no crowds throwing flowers, no beaches that would become shorthand for a generation's sacrifice. There was jungle that swallowed men whole, mountains that broke the backs of the mules sent to climb them, rivers that had to be crossed under fire, and a monsoon that arrived every year like a second enemy, turning tracks into rivers and wounds into infections, and the simple business of staying alive into a daily act of will. The men who fought there called themselves the Forgotten Army, and they were not being self-pitying when they said it. They were being accurate. The supplies came by air or not at all. The maps were often wrong. The enemy was an army that had built its reputation on the belief that it could not be beaten in the jungle, and for a long time the evidence had agreed with them. For the first years of the war, the story in Burma had been one of disaster. The Japanese had invaded in 1942 and driven the British, Indian, and Burmese forces out in the longest retreat in British military history, a withdrawal of nearly 1,000 miles that ended, beaten and exhausted, at the frontier of India. But by 1944, the tide had turned. On the very threshold of India, at two places whose names would mean everything to the men who fought there and almost nothing to anyone else, the Japanese launched the great offensive that was meant to carry them into India and instead destroyed them. At Imphal and at Kohima, the defenders held through weeks of siege and savage close fighting against an enemy who had gambled everything on a quick victory and had no plan for what to do if it did not come. It did not come. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers died on those hills, a great many of them not from bullets but from starvation, as the offensive that was supposed to feed itself on captured British supplies starved in the mud instead. The army that had seemed unstoppable 2 years earlier had broken itself against a line that would not move. The man who presided over that reversal was Lieutenant General William Slim, commander of the 14th Army, and he was the rarest kind of general, the kind his soldiers trusted. The force he led was one of the most extraordinary military formations of the entire war, a vast multinational army in which British soldiers fought alongside Indians of every region and religion, alongside Africans from the west and the east of that continent, alongside the men of Nepal. Through the winter of 1944 into the spring of 1945, Slim drove this army south and east in a reconquest that did not stop. They crossed the great Irrawaddy River, they seized the road and rail hub at Meghtila and the old royal capital at Mandalay, and on the 3rd of May 1945, Allied forces entered Rangoon, the capital and the great port of the south, and the Japanese grip on Burma was, for all practical purposes, finished. But an army that is finished is not the same thing as an army that has gone home. Down in the coastal region of Arakan, in the far west, An entire Japanese force had spent the long months of the campaign defending the approaches to the sea. This was the 28th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai, and across the previous year, its divisions had been worn steadily down. In January of 1945, on a low ridge that the maps marked only as Hill 170, British and Commonwealth troops broke the back of Sakurai's 54th Division in 36 hours of fighting so ferocious that it effectively destroyed the division as a fighting formation. With Arakan lost and central Burma collapsing behind them, the survivors had one option left, and it was not a good one. They had to escape eastward across the Irrawaddy into a long range of jungle-covered hills called the Pegu Yomas, and from there break out toward the Japanese lines further east. A beaten, sick, starving army was trying to slip away through the back of the house while the 14th Army came in through the front, and the 14th Army had no intention of letting it. All across that country, in the early summer of 1945, the British were placing blocks on the routes the enemy would have to use. 200 soldiers from the hills of Nepal were about to become one of those blocks, but to understand why men from Nepal were standing in the path of a Japanese army at all, you have to understand who the Gurkhas were and why the British had spent more than a century learning never, under any circumstances, to underestimate them. The relationship had begun, as so many of the strange marriages of empire began, with a war. In 1814, the East India Company sent its armies into the kingdom of Nepal in the confident expectation of an easy conquest, and the hillmen they met across the next 2 years taught them a lesson they would carry for the rest of their imperial history. The company won the war, but it won narrowly, and at a price that genuinely shocked it, against an enemy who fought with a discipline and a tenacity and a complete absence of fear that the British had not expected from what they had imagined would be a pushover. When the fighting ended in 1816, the British came away with a treaty and a slice of territory, but they came away with something they valued more. They came away convinced that they had just fought some of the finest natural soldiers in the world, and they did the most clear-eyed thing an empire can do when it meets an enemy like that. They began to recruit them. For more than 200 years since that war, the men of Nepal have served the British crown, and they have done it with a loyalty and a ferocity that long ago passed into legend. They come, most of them, from the hard hill country of a poor nation, where a place in a regiment has always meant honor and pay and a way to lift a family, and the competition to be chosen has always been brutal. They carry a knife called the kukri, a heavy curved blade, forward-weighted, equally a tool of daily life, and a weapon of terrible close effect. They go into battle behind a war cry that has unsettled the enemies of Britain for generations, Ayo Gorkali, which means, roughly, the Gurkhas are upon you, and they carry a regimental creed that tells you almost everything about the spirit the British were buying when they enlisted these men. A single line that the soldiers say to one another in the worst moments, when fear is closest. Better to die than live a coward. A celebrated field marshal of the Indian Army, himself commissioned into a Gurkha regiment, once put the same idea in a sentence that has been quoted ever since. If a man tells you he is not afraid of dying, he said, then either the man is lying or he is a Gurkha. In the First World War, 200,000 Gurkhas had gone to fight for the British. In the Second, roughly 250,000 of them left their villages for a war fought across the globe in deserts and mountains and jungles most of them had never imagined. One of that 250,000 was a young man named Lachhiman Gurung. He had been born on the 30th of December, 1917, in a village called Dakhani, in the Tanahu district of Nepal, the son of a man named Rifleman Gurung, into the kind of hill country life that left almost no record beyond the people who lived it. He was small, even by the standards of his own people, 4 feet 11 inches in his bare feet, and that smallness shaped the first chapter of his military life before any of the rest of it could begin. When he first presented himself to enlist, he was turned away, and not only once, because in peacetime the British Indian Army held to a minimum height and could afford to be particular about the bodies it accepted. The boy from Dakhani did not meet the standard. He was, by the measure that mattered to the recruiting officer, too small to be a soldier. But the war did not allow the army to remain particular for long. As the demand for men swelled through 1940, the old standards bent and then broke, and the height that had barred him was waived, and in December of that year, the boy who had been too short to serve finally pulled on a uniform. He was 23 years old. He was sent as a rifleman to the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles, a regiment first raised in 1824 and known throughout the army by an affectionate nickname, the Shiny 8. Remember the shape of that beginning, because it is the shape of the whole story. Britain's first answer to Lachhiman Gurung had been no. It took a world war to turn that no into a yes, and it would take a single night in Burma to make the world learn the name of the man it had nearly turned away for good. The battalion he joined had a hard recent past, and the officer who would lead it through the campaigns last spring had a reputation hard enough to match. The 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles had been badly mauled in the earlier Arakan fighting, and the man given the job of rebuilding it believed in one thing above almost all others, and that thing was preparation. His name was Walter Collier Walker, and he was the kind of soldier who is far easier to respect than to love. He had been born on the 11th of November, 1912, on a tea plantation in British India, into a military family of the type the empire produced in great numbers. He had survived the catastrophic Quetta earthquake of 1935, which killed tens of thousands in a single night and very nearly added him to the count. He had served on the northwest frontier, in the unforgiving tribal country of Waziristan, where ambush was a way of life and a single careless moment could see a patrol wiped out, and he had made himself a master of precisely that kind of war. He had even served early in the Burma campaign on the staff of Slim himself during the long retreat of 1942, walking back toward India with the beaten army and learning, in the worst possible classroom, exactly what an unprepared force looked like when a confident enemy got among it. Through the great crisis of 1944, the battalion he would inherit had been thrown into the savage fighting around Imphal, where the Japanese offensive against India was being broken month by bloody month, and it had spent that long season learning its lessons under fire and at a cost in dead and wounded. When Walker took command in November of 1944, he set out to make it into something that could survive what was coming, and he did it the only way he knew, which was by driving the men until they were ready. He was abrasive and exacting and obsessive about detail, and he made enemies among his own officers, and he did not particularly care, because his concern was not whether his subordinates liked him, but whether his battalion would live. He drilled them in the brutal arithmetic of jungle fighting, in fire control, in movement, in the discipline of the defensive position, and he gave the battalion a motto that described both the regiment and the man who now led it: live hard, fight hard, and when necessary, die hard. It was not decoration. It was a specification, the standard he held them to, and the men he trained to that standard would meet it before the spring was over, in a manner that even Walker can scarcely have pictured in advance. He would go on, after this war, to one of the most remarkable careers in the British Army, hunting communist insurgents through the jungles of Malaya, directing a half-secret war along the jungle frontier of Borneo, and rising at last to 4-star rank. But all of that lay ahead. In the spring of 1945, he was a battalion commander with a rebuilt unit, and within a few weeks his signature would sit at the bottom of a document recommending one of his riflemen for the highest decoration the British Crown can bestow. At the end of April 1945, the orders came down for the 89th Indian Infantry Brigade, part of Slim's 7th Indian Division, to cross the Irrawaddy and destroy the Japanese forces withdrawing from Arakan before they could reach the safety of the Pegu Yomas. The brigade established itself on the west bank, north of the road running between the towns of Prom and Taungup, the very road the retreating Japanese needed if they were to make their escape, and from that position it sent detachments forward to seal the routes the enemy would have to take. One of those routes ran through a village standing on the bank of the Irrawaddy, a place called Tongdao. The name carries a quiet grandeur when you render it into English. In the local tongue, it means something close to the fortress of Moses, and the place had the sort of position that names like that attach themselves to: a settlement in the green ribbon of the river valley with the dry hill country at its edges and higher ground rising behind it. To block the enemy's passage through Taungdav, the 4th Battalion of the 8th Gurkha Rifles detached 2 of its companies, B Company and C Company, and ordered them forward to hold the ground above the village. 2 companies, something close to 200 men. They dug their position into the high ground, and they waited for an enemy that was meant to come stumbling past them in retreat, an enemy they had been sent to intercept and destroy. It did not unfold the way the plan had written it. By the 9th of May, the Japanese, after a sequence of desperate attacks elsewhere along the front, broke contact and began to fall back toward the Taungdav Valley, exactly as the planners had expected, with one crucial difference. They did not file past the block to be cut down. They came straight at it, and there were far, far more of them than 200 Gurkhas could simply sweep away. In a short time, the 2 companies that had been sent to surround the enemy discovered that the enemy had surrounded them. Their lines of communication were severed. Their routes back to the rest of the brigade were closed off. The hunters had become the hunted, holding a position above a village with the river behind them, and a determined enemy massing in the dark on every side, and the relief that might eventually reach them, a battalion of Sikhs, was still days away across ground the Japanese now held. The arithmetic of the situation was not complicated, and every man on that position had worked it out for himself. There were too many of the enemy and not enough Gurkhas, and the relief was too far. And the only question that mattered now was whether the position could be held until help fought its way through. The heaviest blow, when it landed, would fall on the most forward trench of the entire defense and on the smallest man inside it. It is worth pausing to understand the men who would deliver that blow, because they were not the confident army that had conquered Burma 3 years earlier. The soldiers of the 28th Army who gathered around Taungdao were the survivors of a long defeat, half-starved, ravaged by malaria and dysentery, short of ammunition and food and almost everything else an army needs, and they knew with absolute clarity that the ground in front of the Gurkhas was the difference between escape and annihilation. That knowledge made them more dangerous, not less. A cornered army with nowhere left to run fights with a desperation that a victorious one rarely has to summon. The Japanese soldier of that campaign had been schooled in a doctrine that prized the night attack and the close assault, the infiltration through the dark and the sudden rush at the bayonet, and he had been taught to regard surrender as a disgrace worse than death and to spend his own life freely in the attempt to take an enemy position. In Burma, the fighting had a particular intimacy that the open battlefields of the West seldom matched. Positions were taken and held and lost at a range of a few yards with the grenade and the bayonet, and, in the worst moments, the bare hands, in jungle so thick that a man could not always see the enemy who was trying to kill him until they were close enough to touch. The ground itself chose where the worst of it would happen. A defensive position in that kind of country is never a single line but a web of mutually supporting posts, sighted to cover each other, and to dominate the ground an attacker would have to cross, and the most forward of all the posts in the Gurkha position lay roughly 100 yards ahead of the main company locality, out where a jungle path climbed up toward the platoon's ground. Whoever held that forward post held the key to everything behind it. The path it overlooked was the natural line of attack. the obvious avenue up into the heart of the defense, and the document that would later be written about what happened there set out the tactical truth of it without any drama at all. Had that forward post been overrun, had the enemy seized it and held it, the entire reverse slope of the Gurkha position would have been dominated and turned, and the whole defense would have unraveled from the inside. It was the most dangerous task in the most dangerous place on the position, and on the night of the 12th of May, 1945, that task belonged to 3 men. One of them was Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung. The other 2 were fellow Gurkhas, riflemen like him, and the record that has come down to us across the decades does not preserve their names. A small silence that tells you something about how these stories survive and how much of them is quietly lost along the way. The 3 of them shared the forward trench as the light drained out of the sky and the heat of the day gave way to the close-breathing dark of the Burmese night. Around them, the jungle was full of an enemy they could hear but could not yet see. An enemy that had spent the daylight hours moving into position, studying the ground, choosing its angles of approach. Each of the 3 carried a rifle, the standard weapon of the British and Indian armies, a bolt-action rifle that a soldier had to work by hand between every shot, throwing the bolt up and back to eject the spent cartridge and forward and down to chamber the next. It was a reliable weapon and an accurate one, and like very nearly everything in the army's inventory, it had been built for a right-handed man. That single fact sat in the bottom of the trench with them, unremarkable, unremarked, the way the most important facts so often do, waiting for the moment it would become the only thing in the world that mattered. At 20 minutes past 1 in the morning, that moment came. At 1:20 hours on the 13th of May, at least 200 Japanese soldiers came out of the darkness and assaulted the Gurkha company position. The full weight of that opening attack fell upon Lachhiman Gurung's section, and upon his forward post in particular, because the enemy understood the ground every bit as well as the defenders did, and knew that the path his trench commanded was the way in. Before they came on with bayonet and boot, they came on with grenades, hurling them in from close range in a barrage designed to stun the defenders and empty the trench before the infantry arrived to take it. It was a kind of violence difficult to convey on paper. The darkness torn open by blast after blast, earth and metal thrown through the air, the concussion of each explosion felt in the chest as much as heard in the ears. And then one of the grenades did exactly what the enemy had intended. It came down onto the very lip of Gurung's trench, a live grenade with its fuse burning, a second or two from killing every man in the post. Gurung did not freeze, and he did not flinch. He reached out, closed his hand around it, and threw it back into the darkness it had come from, and it burst out there among the men who had thrown it. A moment later, a second grenade came in, and this one did not land on the lip of the trench, but inside it, down among the 3 of them. Again Gurung moved before deliberation could even begin, the way a man moves when the alternative to moving is certain death. He snatched the grenade up off the floor of the trench and flung it back over the parapet, and again it detonated outside, out in the night, away from the men it had been thrown to kill. 2 grenades, 2 separate moments when the forward post should have become a grave for 3 men, and 2 times the smallest soldier in it had reached out, taken hold of his own death, and hurled it back where it came from. And then the 3rd grenade fell. It landed just in front of the trench, close, and Gurung reached for it as he had reached for the others, because the pattern had been set now, twice over, and there was no time left to do anything except the thing that had already worked twice. But this time, the burning fuse ran out before his arm could finish the motion. The 3rd grenade exploded in his right hand. The blast took his fingers. It shattered the bones of his right arm. It drove fragments into his face and his torso and his right leg, and it took, though he would not know for certain until later, the sight of his right eye. In a single instant, the rifleman who had saved the trench twice over had himself been reduced to a catalogue of dreadful wounds, and his 2 companions, who had been close beside him through the whole of it, were badly wounded as well. knocked down and out of the fight, unable to lift a weapon or to help him lift one. The grenade barrage that had been meant to clear the forward post had failed to clear it, but it had done something nearly as useful from the enemy's point of view. It had reduced the single most important position on the entire defense to one maimed and bleeding man. Whatever was going to happen next would happen to a soldier with one working hand, one working eye, and a wave of screaming infantry already coming up the jungle path toward him through the dark. What he did next is the only reason that anyone alive today knows his name. There is a temptation in telling a story like this one to reach for the vocabulary of the superhuman, and the temptation should be refused because the truth of what Lachhiman Gurung did is both simpler and far harder than that. He was not superhuman. He was a grievously wounded young man in enormous pain who had every imaginable reason to sink down into the bottom of that trench and wait for the end to find him. And instead he chose to fight, and then he kept choosing it, second after second, for the better part of the next 4 hours. He could no longer use his right hand, so he used his left. He took up his rifle, the weapon built for a right-handed man, and he began to work the bolt with the wrong hand in the dark, by feel, loading and firing and loading again, a thing that sounds almost minor when it is written in a sentence and is in reality an act of grinding, deliberate, ceaselessly repeated will. Nothing about that rifle had been designed to be worked the way he was now forced to work it. Throw the bolt with the left hand, find the trigger, fire into the noise and the shapes and the muzzle flashes. Throw the bolt again, the wrong way, with the wrong hand, the stump of the other arm useless beside him, and again, and again. And the Japanese kept coming. They rushed the position in waves, screaming as they came, certain that the forward post must surely be empty, or as good as empty after what the grenades had done to it. And every time they came, they found that it was not empty at all, that someone was still down in it, firing, refusing to surrender a single yard of the ground. And he answered them. Out of that ruined trench, in the worst hours of his life, Lachhiman Gurung shouted into the dark at the men who were trying to kill him, and what he shouted was not a cry for help, but a challenge. Come and fight a Gurkha. He said it again and again between rounds, a small furious voice rising from a broken body, daring an army to come up the path and try, and the men of his own company, further back on the position, heard it. That is the part of this night that the tactical accounts can never quite hold, and it is the part that mattered more than any single rifle ever could. A defense is never only a question of fields of fire and rounds remaining. It is a question of belief, of whether the men holding the line believe that the line can be held at all, and the sound of one rifleman refusing to die at the most forward and most exposed post of the whole position did something to the men behind him that no order from any officer could have done. It told them the position was holding. It told them that if the smallest and most terribly wounded man among them would not give up his ground, then they could not give up theirs. His example, the official record would later state in its careful language, so inspired his comrades that the whole surrounded force resisted the enemy to the last and smashed every attack thrown against it. What was in his mind across those 4 hours, we know only from the things he said about it long afterward, and those things were not spoken in the language of heroism. They were spoken in the language of arithmetic. He had looked at his situation, the wounds and the darkness and the waves of men coming up the path, and he had done the only sum that was available to him. And the answer, the sum returned, was that he was going to die. He said so plainly in later years. He had to fight, he said, because there was no other way left to him, and he had felt that he was going to die in any case, and so he might as well die standing on his feet. There is no bravado in a sentence like that. There is only a man who had run clean out of options and had decided what to do with the single one that remained. Not a gesture for an audience that was not there. A decision made once in the dark and then held to through 4 hours of pain and noise and fear by a rifleman who had every reason in the world to make a different one and did not. The waves kept coming, and the wrong hand kept working the bolt, and the small fierce voice kept calling out into the night, "Come and fight a Gurkha." And slowly, round by round, and hour by hour, the darkness began to thin toward gray. When the morning came at last, the men of the company who could still walk went forward to the ground in front of the forward post, and they counted what they found there. In the immediate locality of the company, they counted 87 Japanese dead, and of those 87, 31 lay directly in front of the section that Lachhiman Gurung had held, the key to the whole position, the one trench that should, by every reasonable expectation, have fallen in the first 10 minutes, and had instead held through the entire night. 31 enemy dead in front of one wrecked rifleman and a rifle he had been firing with the wrong hand. But the dawn did not end the siege. The two Gurkha companies were still surrounded, still cut off from the brigade, and the Japanese, with their entire escape depending on forcing a way through, were not finished. What those next days were like for the men inside the position is something the dry language of the records only gestures at. They were cut off, which meant no resupply of ammunition and no easy evacuation of the wounded, and the wounded were many, lying in the bottom of the trenches through the heat of the day and the assaults of the night, with whatever care their comrades could give them between attacks. The heat in that valley in May, in the last weeks before the monsoon broke, was a punishment in itself, and water was never far from a man's mind. The dead, theirs and the enemy's, lay where they had fallen in front of the positions, through the long, bright hours when no attack was coming, and there was nothing to do but wait for the next one and ration what remained. Every man on the position understood the simple shape of the situation. They could not break out because there were too many of the enemy between them and the brigade. They could not be easily relieved because the relief had to fight through that same enemy to reach them. They could only hold and keep holding and trust that the holding would be enough and would not last longer than their ammunition did. The Japanese came at them through the dark again and again across 3 days and 2 nights, throwing themselves at the ground they had to take if they were ever to escape the country alive. And again the Gurkhas broke the attacks against a defense that simply would not give way. Only on the 15th of May did relief finally come, when the 1st Battalion of the 11th Sikh Regiment fought its way through to the cut-off companies and broke the encirclement open at last. The position had never been turned. The door the Gurkhas had been sent to hold had held. How many of the Gurkhas themselves died holding it? The sources that survive do not clearly tell us, and that absence deserves to be named rather than quietly filled in with a number that would only be a guess dressed up as a fact. We know the enemy's dead because the enemy's dead were counted there on the ground in front of the position in the cold clarity of the morning. The cost paid by the men who did the holding, the riflemen of B Company and C Company who fought through those 3 days and 2 nights, is exactly the kind of detail that falls out of the record of a small action in a half-forgotten campaign, and the fact that it fell out is part of the story too. What we do know is that only after the relief had fought its way through could the wounded finally be carried out, and that among the wounded brought back from that forward trench was a rifleman of 27 who had lost his right hand and the sight of his right eye, and who, for one night, had been the single difference between a position that held and a position that fell. His war, in any meaningful sense, was finished. He had given it a hand and an eye and one unrepeatable night in the dark. But Tongdao was only one locked door in a far larger trap, and to understand what that night was truly worth, you have to step back from the trench and look at the army it helped to destroy. Here is the place where the headline and the history part company, and it is worth being honest about the distance between them, because honesty about that distance is the whole point. The number that travels with this story, the one stamped across the front of it, is 10,000. And the men who actually charged that forward post in the dark numbered in the hundreds, not the thousands. The opening assault, the official record tells us, was made by at least 200 of the enemy, and the defenders were 2 companies, something close to 200 Gurkhas. So the 10,000 is not, in the simple sense, the number of men who came up the path, but the 10,000 is not a lie either. It is simply pointed at the wrong target. The 10,000 is not the assault, it is the army. The men at the wire at Tongdao were the leading edge of a far larger Japanese force trying to escape through that country, the survivors of the 28th Army, and that force was being strangled across the whole region in the weeks that followed, of which the stand above Tongdao was a single vital load-bearing thread. The true scale of the dying is almost too large for one trench to contain. By the high summer of 1945, somewhere in the region of 18,000 Japanese troops were trapped in the Peguyomas, the range of jungle hills between the Irrawaddy and the next great river to the east, the Sitang. Penned in, short of food, riddled with sickness, they prepared a mass breakout, a desperate gamble to force their way east across the Sitang before they were destroyed where they stood. To help the trapped men get away, the Japanese command ordered a separate force to mount a diversionary attack across the river, a blow meant to draw British firepower away from the breakout routes. It was a doomed gesture from the start. The force assigned to it could barely muster the strength of a single regiment, and when it went in, at the beginning of July, it went in across country that the monsoon had drowned, fighting for ground that was almost entirely under chest-high water. After days of misery, it had achieved nothing of value and was called off. The diversion had failed to divert, and worse was waiting for the main body, because the British already knew it was coming. Allied intelligence had got hold of captured documents that laid out the breakout in detail, that named the very points where the Japanese intended to cross, and with that knowledge, the British registered their artillery on those crossing points in advance and concentrated their firepower exactly where the enemy would have to come. What followed, in July of 1945, was less a battle than a slaughter. As the Japanese columns tried to move east across ground, the monsoon had turned into a wilderness of flood and mud. The guns that had been waiting for them opened up along the prearranged lines and tore the breakout to pieces. The 54th Division, the same formation broken at Hill 170 back in January, set out on that march roughly 9,000 strong, and fewer than 4,000 of its men reached safety on the far side. Across the whole breakout, the Japanese suffered casualties on the order of 14,000 men, against something nearer 2,000 on the Allied side, and in the single month of July, the Japanese army in Burma lost in the region of 11,500 dead, and disease walked the whole way beside the killing. Cholera and plague moved through the starving, soaking columns, so that a man who lived through the artillery did not always live through the water. He had to wade. This was the army that the block at Tongdao had helped to trap. The stand above that village was small, 2 companies on a slope above a river, but it was the kind of small that decides whether tens of thousands of men get away or die where they are, one nail among many in a coffin that the entire 14th Army was building. This breakout was the last great convulsion of the Japanese army in Burma. In August of 1945, the empire that had once seemed poised to dominate all of Asia surrendered, and the forgotten army had won its war, and by the time the surrender came, the work that men like the Gurkhas of Tongdao had done in the spring was already finished, folded into the larger victory, and, like so much of that campaign, swiftly half forgotten by the world beyond it. What that night had earned Lachhiman Gurung was the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the face of the enemy that the British Crown can give, an honor so rarely bestowed that across all the wars of the modern age, the men who have held it can be numbered only in the hundreds. It is a small thing to look at, a plain cross of dark bronze, cast by tradition from the metal of cannon captured in war, with a simple inscription beneath the crown and lion. For valor. It is deliberately humble, and that humility is the point, because the thing it marks is anything but humble. The Gurkhas have a particular place in its long history, having won it again and again across the wars of the 20th century, far out of proportion to their numbers, until the Cross and the Kukri became, in the mind of the British public on the rare occasions it thought about them at all, two halves of the same idea. The recommendation was written up and signed on the 19th of May, 1945, by his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Walker, the hard, exacting man who had rebuilt the battalion. And on the 19th of December, 1945, at the historic Red Fort in Delhi, the award was made formal. The man who pinned the cross to Lachhiman Gurung's chest was Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, the Viceroy of India, one of the most powerful men in the whole of the British Empire, in a ceremony held at the ancient seat of the Mughal emperors. There is a small disagreement in the records about precisely who performed the investiture, with one account naming a different dignitary, but the weight of the evidence points firmly to Wavell, and the image it leaves behind is the one worth keeping, the second most powerful man in all of India, leaning forward to fix the empire's rarest honor onto the chest of a farmer's son from a hill village that did not have a road running to it. But the image from that day that outlasts all the others is not the Viceroy, or the Red Fort, or even the small dark cross itself. It is a far quieter one, and a far stranger one. When the time came for the ceremony, Lachhiman Gurung's father, Patiman, an old man from a remote village high in the hills of Nepal, set out to make the journey to Delhi so that he could see his son honored, and he did not make that journey alone, or easily, or on his own feet. His neighbors carried him. For 11 days they bore the old man aloft, up over the hills and down out of Nepal, and on across the plains toward the city. 11 days of carrying, so that a father could stand inside the Red Fort and watch the empire give his boy its highest gift. There is no single piece of this entire story that says more in fewer words than that does. Not the medal. The 11 days. A whole community lifting one of its own and carrying him across half a subcontinent because something had happened that was worth being carried that far to witness. And the cost of the honor was written plainly all over the man who received it. The missing right hand, the blind right eye, the long catalogue of wounds that 27 years of hill country life had never prepared him to carry, and that the rest of his life now would. Then the ceremony ended, and the cross was his, and Lachhiman Gurung went home to a small farm in the hills, and for a very long time the world that had honored him for a single winter afternoon proceeded to forget him almost entirely. He went on, which is a quieter kind of courage than the night in the trench, but a courage all the same. Despite the loss of his hand and his eye, he remained a soldier, and when British India was partitioned in 1947 and the Gurkha regiments were divided between the new nations, he transferred into the army of the newly independent India and continued to serve, retiring at last with the rank of Havildar, a sergeant. The partition scattered the world he had known. The old British Indian Army, that vast machine in which a hill boy from Nepal could become a holder of the empire's highest honor, was broken up and divided, and the Gurkha regiments themselves were split between the new Indian Army and the British, the men of Nepal once again finding their service divided by the politics of powers far larger than their own small country. Lachhiman Gurung went where his battalion went, and then, in time, he went home. He returned to the hills he had come from, to a small farm, and a life that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who knew only the citation. And he worked that land for the better part of his remaining years, coaxing what he could from the soil with the single hand the war had left him, while the war he had helped to win sank into the half-light of the forgotten army, and the great empire he had bled for unwound itself into history. And here the thread that has run through this whole story finally pulls tight into the shape it has always been forming, because the contrast at the end of it is impossible to look away from. The officer who had signed his citation, Walter Walker, rose and rose, to a general's rank and a knighthood, and the command of armies, and a permanent place in the military histories of 3 more wars. The rifleman who had actually held the trench grew old quietly on 2 acres of Nepalese hillside, his cross in a box, his name known to almost no one beyond the regiment that treasured it. That is not, in the end, a complaint laid against Walter Walker, who earned every honor he was given. It is simply the arithmetic of recognition, which has never in the whole of human history distributed itself in any honest proportion to what men have actually done. And then near the very end of his long life, the recognition at last came looking for him, because it was needed for a fight that had nothing to do with Burma and everything to do with the question of what Britain owed. In the first decade of the 21st century, a campaign gathered force across Britain over a simple and deeply uncomfortable truth. The Gurkhas had fought and bled and died for the British crown for the better part of 200 years, and yet the men who had given that service were not granted the automatic right to settle in the country they had served. The campaign to overturn that injustice found its most powerful voices not among politicians or generals, but among the old soldiers themselves, and there were few faces it could put before the British public more quietly devastating than that of a tiny, dignified, half-blind holder of the Victoria Cross. Lachhiman Gurung, by then in his late 80s and into his 90s, became one of the living symbols of that fight. In 2008, he came to Britain himself and settled in Hounslow in West London and was made a freeman of the borough. More than 60 years after he had held a forward trench against an empire's enemy, he was standing in the heart of that empire's successor, asking for the right to live within its borders. And the campaign succeeded. The settlement rights were won, and on the 12th of December 2010, Lachhiman Gurung died in a London hospital of pneumonia at the age of 92, a very long way and a very long time from the trench at Tongdao, having lived just long enough to see the country he had fought for finally say yes to the men like him that it had so often and for so long been so slow to thank. The recruiting officer in the hills of Nepal looked at a boy of 4 feet 11 inches and saw someone too small to be a soldier, and Britain's first answer to Lachhiman Gurung was no. It took a world war to turn that answer into yes. It took one night above a village called the Fortress of Moses to show the empire what it had so nearly thrown away, and it took another 60 years and more before the country he saved was willing to offer the men who served beside him a home within its borders. The distance between what these soldiers gave and what they were given is a wide one, and it is in that distance, more than in any single act of valor, that the real history of the forgotten army is written, the longest war fought by the men remembered least. He threw back 2 grenades and lost his hand to a third. He worked a rifle built for another man's hand through 4 hours of darkness, and when the sun came up, there were 31 of the enemy dead in front of him. His father was carried for 11 days through the hills to watch him receive the cross. We do not know the names of the 2 men who shared his trench, and we will never know how many of his brother Gurkhas died holding that ground. And those silences are part of what is owed to him as well. The kukri still serves the crown to this day. The war is still half forgotten. The debt is still, in its quiet way, being argued. If you believe that a man who walked into the dark with one hand deserves to be remembered, leave a comment below and say his name out loud. And if you want to understand the war that Britain tried hardest to forget, and the soldiers who have always paid its highest price, watch this next.